The night was October 13th, 1307. Along the harbor of La Rochelle, the salt wind carried the faint creak of rigging and the whisper of sails unfurling. By torchlight, men in white mantles crossed the docks, their shadows long and wavering across the planks. One by one, the ships pushed out into the tide, and then they were gone. No wreckage, no records, no tidy account in royal archives, just the echo of timbers knocking in the swell, like distant drums fading into mist. From that night onward, a silence stretches across the centuries. Where did they go, these knights turned sailors, and what did they carry with them into the darkness? Was it only their lives, fleeing persecution, or something heavier, the kind of cargo kings and popes would have feared to see vanish into the open sea? Rumors rose like gulls startled into flight. Some whispered that the ships bent northward, toward Scotland's hidden coves, to seek shelter beneath misty cliffs and outlawed kings. Others said they found haven farther south, where Portugal's coast was guarded by allies who would later raise a new banner, a red cross, painted on white sails. And then there were the boldest of whispers, that the fleet slipped westward, out into the uncharted Atlantic, bearing maps, relics, and secrets that might never reach the eyes of Europe again. Treasure of coin, perhaps, treasure of parchment, perhaps more dangerous still. Tonight we will drift with them, following the scattered traces they left behind. We will walk the misty quays of La Rochelle, read the faint notations on old maps, and listen to the warped confessions recorded under duress. With each step, the trail grows fainter, like footprints in sand carried off by the tide. But still the story calls us to follow. Welcome, then, to the Bedtime History Series, here on Serene Myths. This is a place to set aside the day's noise and to travel slowly through the mysteries of the past, guided by a gentle voice and the rhythm of the night. If you find peace in these quiet journeys, you may like to linger here, to listen, to share your thoughts, or simply to rest. The tide is rising. The sails are drawn tight. Ahead, the water spreads into silver darkness, and somewhere in that distance a fleet has slipped into legend, leaving only the sound of a drumbeat across the waves. Salt clings to the air at La Rochelle, carried on winds that sweep in from the Atlantic. Walk the harbor even now, and you will see the traces of its medieval bones. Stone walls leaning toward the water, narrow lanes that once funneled carts of salt down to waiting ships, and the long memory of trade. In the 13th and 14th centuries, La Rochelle was more than a port. It was a threshold between land and ocean, between kingdoms and orders, between the known world and the edge of maps. For the Knights Templar, it was a lifeline. Their order is often remembered as warriors of Jerusalem and custodians of the Holy Sepulchre, but by the late Middle Ages, they were also mariners, merchants, and financiers. At La Rochelle, they maintained vast warehouses, some of stone, others timbered and tarred, where barrels of wine, grain, and especially salt were stored. Salt was wealth in crystal form. It preserved fish, cured meats, and filled coffers with steady revenue. The Templars' dockside houses, it was said, were marked not only with the red cross, but with chalk symbols drawn quickly by sailors, guiding shipments to the right hold. When the French crown struck on that October dawn in 1307, King Philip IV ordered the arrest of every Templar in his realm. The plan was ruthless in its coordination, Sealed letters dispatched to officials across France opened all at once. Monasteries, commanderies, farms, and fortresses were seized in a single sweep. Men awoke to chains and torches, accused of heresies and crimes whispered more than proved. Across the kingdom, assets were frozen, inventories written into ledger books, and soldiers stood watch. Yet here at La Rochelle, the story falters. For all the detailed accounts of confiscated horses, coins, and parcels of land, there is silence about the ships. Contemporary records list cargoes at Marseille, warehouses at Paris, even tapestries seized from rural estates. But the harbor fleet? Absent. Later chroniclers tell of 18 galleys tied in the roadstead ready to sail. But if they were there, why no royal tally? Why no triumphant note of seizure? Instead, only rumor, as though the tide had erased a line from the page. This gap has left room for legends. Some historians argue that La Rochelle was never home to a great Templar navy at all, that the order, while occasionally chartering vessels, relied mostly on hired transport, not its own fleet. A few ships might have been present that night, but hardly enough to warrant the image of a vanished armada. Others suggest that the silence of the records was itself telling, that someone, perhaps forewarned, saw to it that the ledgers were left blank, the docks cleared, and the sails set before the king's men arrived. There are details, fragile as cobwebs, that lend the tale its texture. Accounts describe seals of wax pressed hurriedly onto bundles of parchment, letters of credit, and tallies of debt moved more urgently than chests of coin. In some versions, a chalk circle was drawn on crates meant for immediate departure, a sailor's shorthand for cargo that must travel quickly. Such images may be embellishments, or they may hint at the reality that what the Templars valued most was not gold, but paper, records, agreements, promises that could be honored across Europe, even across seas. Still, whether the fleet was 18 ships or only a handful, the question remains, how could vessels slip away unnoticed? La Rochelle in 1307 was a busy place, but it was also politically complex. For decades, it had been contested ground, once held by the Plantagenet kings of England, later claimed by France, and still a harbor where loyalties and commerce crisscrossed. Officials were not always aligned with Paris, and local sympathies may have run toward the order, which provided employment, protection, and credit. A sympathetic harbor master, a delay in opening the king's orders, or simply the cover of fog could have made the difference. And so we imagine it. The tide pulling out, the fog rolling in, the white sails catching a faint glow of moonlight as they edge away from the quay. Behind them, the warehouses stand shuttered, doors sealed with the red wax of royal authority. Ahead, open water. Did they sail northward, hugging the coasts of Brittany, Normandy, and beyond? Or south, toward Iberia, where allies might still be found? The chronicles are mute. All that remains is the rhythm of speculation, like the waves against the stone jetty. What we do know is that in the weeks and months that followed, arrests spread across France, trials opened, men confessed under pressure and retracted under pain. Yet no definitive word of ships lost or captured appears in the records. This silence is itself a presence, the kind of void that calls to the imagination. Some historians caution that silence does not equal mystery, that absence may simply mean nothing was there, but legends flourish in emptiness, and the story of the lost fleet became one of the most enduring shadows of the Templar downfall. And so, standing at La Rochelle, we find ourselves between fact and fog, salt in the air, gulls wheeling overhead, stone towers keeping their mute watch. The Templars' houses are gone, their commanderies scattered, but the question remains, what happened on that tide? Perhaps the last vision was of sails fading into a horizon of mist, carrying not only men but the last hope of an order under siege. And then, in that fading, the story opens outward. For if the ships were real, if they did indeed leave, then their journey would not end here on the dock. Their wakes would lead across coasts and kingdoms toward whispers of shelter, reinvention, and perhaps even discovery. The sails rise, the ropes creak, and the horizon waits. The night of October 13th did not descend quietly upon France. Bells tolled in towns and villages, their iron tongues striking against cold night air. Orders had been opened at dawn, but by evening the wave of arrests rippled outward. From Paris to Poitiers, from small hamlets to fortified commanderies, soldiers bearing the king's seal forced doors, clamped irons, and read charges of heresy. The Templars, those who had returned from Jerusalem and those who had never left their native soil, were caught unawares. At La Rochelle, however, the atmosphere was different. The city slept beneath a veil of sea fog, the kind that softens lanterns into faint halos and carries the tang of salt into every breath. On the waterfront, the timber piers groaned with the tide, and the faint tapping of rigging against masts sounded like a heartbeat. Here the Templars owned great storehouses, lined with barrels of salt drawn from the marshes inland. Salt was their silent fortune, white as snow, more enduring than coin, for it could preserve the harvests of sea and field alike. Within those warehouses, men worked by lamplight, their voices low, their motions hurried. One chronicler, writing years later, claimed that certain crates bore marks chalked hastily in the dark, symbols not meant for tacksmen or merchants, but for sailors. A circle with a cross inside, said to mean urgent departure. Perhaps it was invention, the embroidery of later centuries, yet the image persists. Boxes sealed with wax, ropes tightened around bundles of parchment, and among them, not heavy chests of gold, but lighter sacks of vellum and paper. If the Templars were to vanish, what they carried might not glitter, it might rustle. Still, we know this much. King Philip's men had been ordered to seize property everywhere in France. At Paris, inventories listed chalices, horses, candelabra, even spoons. At smaller houses, a handful of coins and a Bible might suffice to fill the clerk's page. Yet for La Rochelle, the record falls silent. There is no note of vessels seized, no tally of a fleet in royal hands. This silence is what gives the story its weight. Did the scribes neglect to record it, or was there, by the time the orders reached the harbor, nothing left to take? The debate among historians centers on this absence. Some argue that La Rochelle had no great Templar fleet at all, that the order, while occasionally employing ships, owned few, and relied instead on charters and hired mariners. The picture of 18 galleys ready in the roadstead, often repeated, may have been a later embellishment. A handful of vessels, perhaps, but not an armada. If so, then there was no mystery, only the ordinary passing of hired ships that owed loyalty to no one but their paymasters. Others, however, see in the silence a deliberate gap. A warning might have traveled faster than the king's sealed orders. Perhaps a clerk, sympathetic to the order, delayed the reading of the command just long enough. Or perhaps the Templars themselves, sensing danger, had already begun to move their most precious stores. Ships could vanish in fog, and the Atlantic offered hiding places beyond royal reach. It is not hard to imagine the creak of timbers as lines were cut, the muffled splash of oars pushing vessels into the current, and the sails rising against the moon. One unusual account, buried in a later confession, speaks of a chest of letters sent across the sea in the days before the arrests. It is impossible to know if this was truth, invention, or a tale coerced by interrogators. Yet it fits the image of an order more banker than warrior by the 14th century, where the treasure was measured not in jewels, but in promises written on parchment, promises that could outlive kingdoms if preserved in secret. And so, in that October fog, we picture them. Shadows moving across the docks, barrels rolled, crates lifted, torches dimmed lest they draw the gaze of the watch. Above, the gulls wheel unseen, their cries swallowed by mist. Beyond, the tide draws outward, tugging the vessels toward open sea. Whether they carried treasure, records, or simply themselves, they slipped from the harbor with barely a sound, leaving only the faint echo of wood against wood, like a drum fading into silence. What is certain is that by the time the king's officers had moved to seize La Rochelle, nothing was noted. The warehouses stood, and the salt within could be taken, but of ships nothing remained. The royal ledger kept its silence, and that silence is the cradle of legend. Did the ships sail northward, into the gray waters where Scotland awaited in rebellion, or southward, to the Iberian coast, where sympathizers might shelter them, or farther still, into waters no clerk dared record? The night gives no answer. Only the rhythm of waves against stone, only the whisper of sails vanishing into fog. And as the harbor empties, the story flows onward, following the current toward northern shores, where whispers of knights and kings mingle in the mist. The drumbeat fades, the fog thickens, and somewhere ahead the coast of Scotland waits. The northern seas are different from those of France. The Atlantic here is colder, sharper, restless beneath a ceiling of clouds. Imagine a small vessel nosing its way along the coasts of Brittany, then across the Channel, where waves rise green and steel beneath the sky. To sail north was to risk storms and currents, yet also to find refuge in lands where the French king's reach faltered. Beyond England lay Scotland, caught in its own struggle, a kingdom outlawed by the very church that condemned the Templars. It was here, in the early 14th century, that Robert the Bruce carved his precarious throne. Crowned in 1306, excommunicated soon after for slaying his rival in a church, Bruce lived on the margins of legitimacy. His Scotland was a country under siege, its nobles divided, its fields raided, its castles besieged by the armies of Edward of England. In such a land, outcasts found kinship. Some chroniclers have suggested that a band of Templars, seeking shelter after the arrests of 13 Hohenzollerners, seeking 207, might have slipped ashore among Scotland's rocky coves, where secrecy and loyalty mattered more than papal bulls. The story grows vivid in the telling. 7 years after the fleet vanished in 1314, Bruce faced Edward II at the Battle of Bannockburn. It was a desperate confrontation. Scotland's smaller army against England's might. Yet the legend insists that on the second day, when the English lines faltered, a contingent of mounted knights appeared on the field, their banners unfamiliar, their charge decisive. To later imaginations, these could only have been fugitive Templars, Their skill and discipline tipping the balance of the fight, Scotland triumphed, and Bruce secured his crown for a generation. The unusual detail often repeated is of chests that arrived with these shadowy knights, wooden boxes coated in salt to preserve their contents, hauled up from ships that had crossed the stormy seas. Some say the boxes held silver to fund Bruce's war. Others hint at relics, holy objects carried from the East long before, and still others suggest they were filled with nothing more exotic than grain and tools, the provisions of a practical order trying to begin again. Whatever the truth, the image of salt-crusted coffers remains, relics of the sea, delivered to a land in rebellion. Yet the evidence is slender. Contemporary records of Bannockburn do not mention mysterious reinforcements. The chroniclers who celebrated Bruce's victory described his men, his tactics, and his luck, but not an order of knights from overseas. The Templar connection appears only in much later accounts, centuries after the fact, when romance and secrecy clung to their name. Historians point out that the appearance of unknown horsemen on a battlefield could easily be invention, a way to give Bruce's triumph an air of divine justice, a hint that heaven itself had sent champions to his cause. Still, the legend persists. Perhaps it was nurtured by Scotland's need for symbols of endurance, or by the natural bond between two outlawed powers, the king without papal blessing, and the order without sanctuary. In the mists of memory, they fit together, both standing apart from the crowns and churches that had condemned them. It is easy, under the gray skies of Bannockburn, to imagine the thud of hooves, the glint of steel, and the cross of red or white flashing for an instant before vanishing into legend. Walk the battlefield today, and you will find wide fields, low ridges, and the murmuring of wind through grass. The land itself holds no secrets, only echoes. But in the hush of dusk, when shadows lengthen and a cold mist rises from the river, it is tempting to listen for the faint clash of arms, the cry of unseen horsemen, and the beating of drums swallowed by distance. The mind supplies what the records omit, and so, if the Lost Fleet truly sought Scotland, it was to a realm of struggle and resilience, a land where exiles might find a welcome, not for wealth, but for their skill and their brotherhood. Whether or not they ever rode at Bannockburn, the idea of Templar sails vanishing into northern fog has become part of the story's fabric, stitched into the myth of Scotland's long defiance. But the north was only one current. To the south and west, the tides turned differently, carrying whispers of another sanctuary. For while Scotland was a rebel's haven, Portugal offered something subtler, reinvention under a new name, and the promise of survival not in hiding, but in transformation. The wind shifts, the gulls wheel, and the sound of distant horns fades into the surf. Ahead lies a warmer shore, where sails bear a crimson cross and an old order is reborn. Dawn in Portugal comes with the scent of orange blossoms and the sharp tang of tar along the shipyards. The air is softer than the harsh winds of the northern seas, and the harbors open toward horizons long favored by sailors. If Scotland was a refuge for the outlawed, Portugal was a cradle for rebirth. Here, the red cross on white sails would not vanish. It would be painted larger, bolder, until it became a banner known across the oceans of the world. By the year 1319, 12 years after the arrests of 1307, the Templar Order had been formally dissolved by papal decree. In France, Their lands were seized, their leaders tried, and eventually Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master, burned upon an island in the Seine. Yet in Portugal, a different story unfolded. King Dinis, known for his cautious wisdom, negotiated with the papacy to establish a new order, the Ordem de Cristo, the Order of Christ. Officially, it was not the Templars, yet in practice it absorbed much of their property, their networks, and perhaps their men. This fact is well recorded. The castles, estates, and commanderies once belonging to the Templars in Portugal were transferred to this new body. Where other countries scattered their remnants, Portugal offered continuity. The Red Cross, altered slightly, was emblazoned on sails and shields. To later generations, this became the symbol that would cross the Atlantic with the caravels of Henry the Navigator, Vasco da Gama, and Pedro Alvarez Cabral. The same cross that may once have flown over Jerusalem now guided ships to India, Africa, and the New World. One unusual detail ties the Order of Christ more closely to the myth of the Lost Fleet. In Lisbon and Tomar, there are accounts of ceremonies in which former Templar knights were quietly accepted into the new order, allowed to take their vows again under a new name. Imagine the scene. Men who had once faced trial and suspicion standing once more in the round church of Tomar, candles flickering, the air heavy with incense. The vows spoken were familiar, though the name had changed. Outside on the river Tagus, ships waited with fresh paint on their hulls. To the townsfolk, they might have seemed like ordinary traders, but to the knights, they were continuations of something older, sails carrying forward the life of a brotherhood reborn. Historians debate how much of this was genuine continuity and how much was a political invention. Was the Order of Christ truly the Templars in disguise, or was it simply a pragmatic measure by a king to preserve useful lands and structures? King Dinis had little interest in antagonizing the Pope or the French crown. By renaming the order, he satisfied Rome, while ensuring the valuable estates did not fall into foreign hands. The men who entered this order may not all have been fugitive Templars, but local Portuguese knights, farmers, and administrators repurposed into a new hierarchy. Continuity, yes, but perhaps more bureaucratic than romantic. Yet the symbols tell another tale. When we look at the sails of the Portuguese caravels centuries later, the crimson cross stretched wide across the canvas. We see the echo of that older order. It is as though the ships of La Rochelle, lost to the fog, had reappeared in Iberian waters, their sails grown brighter, their purpose widened to encompass the oceans themselves. The motif of transformation, death in France, rebirth in Portugal, gives the myth its enduring power. There are whispers, too, of treasure transferred quietly into Portuguese hands. Not heaps of gold, but navigational knowledge, maps, and methods. Some suggest that the Templars, who had long sailed to and from the Holy Land, possessed charts of the Atlantic unknown to others, passed on through secretive channels. If so, those charts may have been preserved and later used in the great voyages of discovery. It is a speculation with little proof, but it lingers like a shadow on the map, a question mark etched in salt water. Walk the castle of Tomar today, and you will see symbols carved into stone, crosses, circles, interlaced patterns that hint at continuity of ritual. The round church itself, modeled on the Holy Sepulchre, glows with painted frescoes and gilded panels. Once, perhaps, men who had fled across seas stood within those walls, listening to Latin chants that spoke of endurance. Outside, the Tagus carried ships toward horizons unseen. If the fleet of La Rochelle reached Portugal, it did not need to hide in coves or vanish into legend. It could dissolve into the fabric of a kingdom willing to shelter it, changing its name, but keeping its essence. It is a quieter survival, less dramatic than visions of battles in Scotland or voyages to unknown continents, but perhaps more believable. Not an armada lost, but a brotherhood reborn under another cross. And yet, the mystery deepens. For while Portugal offered continuity, there remain tales that some ships did not stop there at all. That beyond the safety of Iberia, sails carried on westward, into waters no one could yet claim. The Atlantic was vast, filled with stories of phantom islands and coasts glimpsed by sailors in storms. The idea that the Templars, with their secretive maps and seasoned mariners, might have ventured into that darkness gave rise to one of the boldest whispers of all. The tide of the Tagus swells, the sails of Crimson Cross fade into distance, and the horizon stretches unbroken. The sea itself becomes the next chapter, a silver expanse under the moon, where whispers of the new world begin to rise. The ocean at night is a mirror of the heavens. Stars scatter across the sky, and their reflections shimmer in the swell until one cannot tell where the heavens end and the waters begin. Imagine, then, a small fleet slipping westward, leaving behind the shores of France and Iberia. Their sails billow against the steady trade winds, their prows cutting into the darkness. Each creak of timber, each snap of canvas, becomes a heartbeat in the silence. Out here, no king's order can reach them. Only the endless Atlantic, vast and unclaimed. From the Middle Ages onward, sailors told stories of lands lying beyond the horizon. Irish monks had spoken of High Brazil, an island veiled in mist, appearing once every 7 years. Norse sagas told of Vinland, rich with grapes and timber. Mariners whispered of Antillia, the island of 7 cities, founded by bishops fleeing the Muslim conquest of Iberia. These tales drifted from port to port, half myth, half memory, and they found their way onto maps, shadowy islands inked at the edges, always slightly out of reach. Into this lore stepped the vanished fleet. If their ships sailed west, what might they have found? Some say they carried maps older than Christendom, fragments of knowledge gathered from the East during the Crusades, charts of currents, stars, and coastlines unknown to most Europeans. The Templars, so skilled in logistics, might have preserved such treasures in their archives, smuggled aboard in crates sealed with wax and linen, not gold, but knowledge, the kind of wealth that could open entire worlds. There is an unusual detail often cited in this telling. Centuries later, when explorers under Henry the Navigator and Christopher Columbus set sail, they carried charts that depicted islands not yet discovered. Some bore uncanny resemblance to real places, like the Azores or the Canaries, drawn before official records acknowledge their sighting. A few enthusiasts argue these charts hint at earlier voyages, perhaps by Templar mariners, their discoveries folded into secrecy until the world was ready. It is speculation, but a tantalizing one, a ghost of ink that suggests memory outliving its source. Yet historians caution restraint. There is no direct evidence of Templars crossing the Atlantic. Medieval ships were capable, but the leap was immense, the risks severe. To sail west without promise of return would demand extraordinary purpose. And so the debate endures. Were the stories of Templars in the New World born of fact, or of the human tendency to weave absent chapters from silence? After all, myths cling to gaps the way barnacles cling to hulls. The less we know, the more we imagine. Still, the image is powerful. Picture them. Sails white under moonlight, a red cross catching the glow of starlight, men standing at the rail as dolphins break the surface beside them, glowing faintly with phosphorescence. Their eyes turn westward, toward the line where sea and sky meet. Perhaps they dreamed of lands untamed by crowns, where they could begin again, free from papal decrees and royal arrests. Perhaps they dreamed of safety, of quiet valleys and rivers where their brotherhood might endure in secrecy. Perhaps they dreamed of nothing more than survival, each dawn a gift on waters that could claim them at any hour. The Atlantic itself feeds the legend, for sailors returning to Europe told of floating forests of seaweed, the Sargasso Sea, where currents slowed and ships seemed trapped. They told of waters suddenly warm, of storms rising from nowhere, of birds flying out of the west with no land in sight. Each strange encounter added to the sense that beyond the horizon lay something vast, something hidden. Into this atmosphere of wonder and fear, the Lost Fleet fits neatly, like a missing piece of a puzzle that may never be whole. Even today, some claim to trace echoes. Folklore among certain coastal peoples in the Americas speaks of pale strangers arriving long before Columbus. Patterns carved into stone, crosses etched on caves, or villages where tales of armored visitors persist, each becomes a fragment that fuels the story. None of these fragments prove the fleet's voyage, yet together they form a mosaic of possibility, shimmering like stars reflected in dark water. And so the ships sail on in our minds, their sails taut with the night wind, their course invisible, their wake erased by time. Were they swallowed by storms, sinking into the abyss where no chronicle records their passing? Or did they find a shore, plant their banners, and vanish into forests too wide for rumor to cross? The ocean does not answer. It keeps its secrets well, murmuring only in the language of waves. As the stars wheel overhead, the wind shifts. The whispers of the sailors fade, replaced by the rustle of parchment in some distant cabin. For perhaps, after all, the greatest treasure carried westward was not gold or relics, but the fragile weight of documents, the knowledge of debts, alliances, and secrets that could outlast empires. The sails disappear into mist. The sea is silent. And in the quiet, we turn from waves to paper, from horizon to archive. What if the true cargo of the Templars was never meant to glitter, but to whisper? In a chamber lit by a single candle, the scene is quieter than the roar of seas or the clash of swords. A wooden table stands in shadow. Wax drips slowly down its side, pooling on the grain. A hand moves across parchment, folding sheets, pressing seals, tying cords of linen. Here lies another vision of the Templar treasure, not chests of bullion or relics glittering in torchlight, but ink, paper, and the fragile authority of words. By the 14th century, the Order of the Temple was not merely a military brotherhood. It had become one of the most sophisticated financial networks of Europe. Pilgrims bound for Jerusalem could deposit funds in Paris and withdraw them in Acre. Kings borrowed from the Templars to fund their wars. Nobles entrusted them with estates to be managed, rents collected, debts repaid. The true wealth of the order was not gold stacked in a vault, but numbers written in ledgers, promises locked in archives, and symbols recognized from one continent to another. One fact stands clear. When King Philip IV ordered the seizure of Templar property, much of what was inventoried was mundane. Horses, furniture, farm tools, a scattering of coins. What was missing from many lists was paperwork. Some ledgers appear incomplete, as though the most sensitive records had been spirited away before officials arrived. Without those documents, the full picture of what the Templars controlled, who owed them money, which debts could be called in, which secrets were written down, remains a blank. For a monarch drowning in debt to the order, the loss of such records would have been more threatening than the escape of treasure chests. An unusual detail survives in scattered references: the linen sacks, or hampers of parchment carried between commanderies. These were not stored in gilded chests, but wrapped in plain cloth to protect them from damp, tied with wax seals that cracked softly when opened. To an untrained eye, they might have seemed unremarkable, bundles of paper, easily overlooked amid barrels of salt or grain, yet within could lie the very architecture of the order's influence: maps of properties, tallies of rents, contracts of debt. Imagine such bundles loaded into the holds of ships at La Rochelle, marked with chalk for urgent departure, their value invisible except to those who knew how to read them. Historians debate whether this archive theory explains the mystery of the fleet. Did the Templars truly smuggle their ledgers abroad, ensuring that their wealth was preserved in invisible form? Or are we mistaking absence in the records for a deliberate act? Some scholars argue that the paperwork was never found because it was destroyed, not hidden. In this view, the order's administrators may have burned sensitive documents themselves, protecting clients and allies from exposure. Better ash than confiscation. Others, however, see in the silence a clue that somewhere in a Scottish abbey, a Portuguese castle, or even a vault across the seas, the financial heart of the Templars survived in exile. If true, the implications are vast. Gold can be spent, jewels dispersed, relics broken, but archives endure. With ledgers in hand, the exiled order could call in debts, direct allies, and fund new ventures under new names. This might explain how their legacy appears to surface in later centuries. In the maritime strength of Portugal, in the myths of Scottish support, even in the distant echoes of Freemasonry, where secrecy and symbols carry the weight once borne by parchment and seal. Consider the quiet power of a single document. A promissory note written in Paris could be redeemed in London or Rome. A coded ledger could conceal identities yet preserve obligations. A map annotated with coastal currents could guide a ship safely across a sea. To lose such documents was to lose memory itself. To preserve them was to preserve continuity, even in exile. And so, when we imagine the Lost Fleet, we might picture not holds filled with glittering treasure, but cabins stacked with bundles of linen-wrapped parchment, guarded more fiercely than gold. By the glow of lanterns, knights and clerks alike might have read them by night, their breath misting in the cold air, their fingers smudged with wax. The sound of the sea outside mingled with the faint rustle of pages, a reminder that their survival depended not on steel or silver, but on the quiet endurance of ink. What became of those papers, if they existed? Were they absorbed into the records of the Order of Christ in Portugal, repurposed under new seals? Were they hidden in monasteries, where monks copied fragments into archives whose purpose was forgotten? Or were they lost entirely, consigned to flames when secrecy became more precious than survival? The trail ends in shadows, leaving only speculation, as though the documents themselves had dissolved into mist. The candle flickers lower. Wax pools across the table, a small river of gold hardened into stillness. Smoke curls upward, thin and gray, disappearing into the rafters. Outside, the sound of waves strikes the stone quay, steady as a drumbeat. Perhaps the treasure was paper. Perhaps it was gold. Perhaps it was only memory, carried in silence by those who survived. The candle dies. Darkness settles. And in that darkness, the story shifts. Ahead lie the hypotheses, the three great currents into which all these fragments flow, each offering its own explanation of what happened to the fleet and why its legend endures. The first current of thought carries us northward and southward, to shores where kings ruled outside the immediate grasp of Philip IV. If the fleet sailed from La Rochelle, perhaps it found refuge in Scotland, where Robert the Bruce was fighting for survival, or in Portugal, where King Dinis maneuvered carefully between papal loyalty and royal independence. The fact is clear. Scotland and Portugal both stood apart from French control in 1307. Scotland, excommunicated yet unbowed, fought a war of defiance against England. Portugal, though Catholic, was ruled by a king pragmatic enough to negotiate his own solutions. When the papacy dissolved the Templars in 1312, King Dinis established the Order of Christ in 1319, absorbing Templar lands and very likely their surviving members. Legends cling to this hypothesis like seaweed on a keel. In Scotland, stories of Templar horsemen at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314 endure, their sudden charge tipping the scales of victory. In Portugal, one unusual detail stands out: the Red Cross of the Order of Christ, painted boldly on sails centuries later, leading explorers into the Atlantic. To many, it seems too neat, too continuous, to be coincidence. The lost fleet re-emerging in Iberian waters, its legacy blossoming into global exploration. Yet historians remind us that continuity can be an illusion. The Bannockburn tale, for instance, appears only in sources written long after the event. Contemporary chronicles make no mention of mysterious knights. Likewise, the Order of Christ, though inheriting Templar lands, was not necessarily staffed by fugitive brothers from La Rochelle. Many of its members were local Portuguese knights, carefully repurposed for legitimacy. What looks like survival may in fact be reinvention, a pragmatic king's way of harnessing useful resources without inviting papal wrath. Still, the story persists because it feels possible. The idea that the fleet dissolved into Scotland's mists or Portugal's harbors offers a vision of survival, not extinction. It gives the Templars a future beyond the flames of Paris, one where their cross still flew, if under altered names. The tide carries this theory onward, whispering of harbors where sails once lowered and papers were signed anew. Another current flows in a harsher direction, that there was no escape, no survival, only confiscation. King Philip IV, burdened with debt to the Templars, had every incentive to move quickly. The arrests of October 1307 were not only about heresy, but about money, the chance to erase obligations and absorb the wealth of a powerful rival. The fact speaks loudly. Inventories of Templar holdings across France were taken, sealed, and stored. Properties were transferred to the crown or the hospitallers, though not without delays and disputes. In Paris, treasure was catalogued. In rural commanderies, officials pried open coffers, counted coins, and marched away with spoils. To Philip's clerks, it must have been a triumph, a ledger balanced, a debt erased. An unusual detail colors this picture. Some inventories record entire categories marked empty or not found. Scholars have puzzled over these blank lines. Were the goods already removed, spirited away before the arrests? Or were they simply lost in poor accounting, clerks failing to note what had been seized? The ambiguity is striking, for it suggests that even in the crown's triumph, something was missing. Critics of the Lost Fleet myth argue that the silence about La Rochelle is exactly this: a bureaucratic gap, not a legend. They contend that the fleet never truly existed, at least not in the grand form imagined later. A few ships may have been present, but most maritime resources had been contracted, not owned. What Philip seized was land, coin, and debt records, not an armada of vessels laden with treasure. The absence in the archives, in this view, proves not escape, but exaggeration. Yet the notion of laundering wealth through royal seizure is itself haunting. If Philip indeed captured the archives in gold, he may have hidden the traces deliberately, folding them into royal accounts to prevent creditors from resurfacing. What better way to erase a rival's influence than to smother it under layers of bureaucracy? The vanished fleet, then, is not a legend of escape, but of absorption, its traces dissolved in the ink of royal ledgers. The drums of La Rochelle fade here, not into open seas, but into the echo of hammers, closing a treasury vault. Still, the question remains, why? If everything was seized, do we feel the emptiness so keenly? The final current carries us away from both escape and capture into subtler waters. Perhaps there was no single fleet of great ships, no single seizure of treasure. Perhaps instead the Templars scattered their wealth in fragments, like seeds carried by wind. A chest here, a ledger there, a promise preserved in secrecy rather than stone. The fact, the Templars were masters of decentralization. Their network of preceptories stretched from the Holy Land to Ireland. They moved money not by caravans of gold, but by letters of credit, honored from one commandery to another. This structure made them resilient and hard to eradicate. Even if Philip IV seized Paris, even if papal bulls suppressed the order, the system could not easily be destroyed. Its pieces lived on in the hands of allies, clients, and surviving brothers. The unusual detail lies in stories of bundles of parchment wrapped in linen, carried from stronghold to stronghold. Some say these treasures were loaded aboard ships in La Rochelle, destined for safer shores. Others imagine they were buried in cellars or hidden in abbeys, passed quietly into other archives. In this telling, the fleet was less a convoy of ships than a metaphor, a way to describe the dispersal of records across many waters. Historians debate this theory vigorously. Some argue that it romanticizes bureaucracy, turning ledgers into myth. After all, most archives from the period have been lost, destroyed not by secrecy, but by the slow erosion of time. Why imagine an intentional hiding when ordinary neglect explains the loss? Others, however, see the deliberate gaps in royal inventories as a clue that something truly was spirited away. Paper, not gold, may have been the order's greatest treasure, and it would have been both portable and invisible. The motif here is one of whispers, not drums. The flutter of pages, the sigh of wind across parchment, the rustle of secrets carried like seeds. If the Templars survived in any form, perhaps it was not as knights on horseback or sailors on caravels, but as ideas, methods, and financial tools quietly absorbed into the bloodstream of Europe. The fleet's disappearance, then, was less a voyage into distance than a dispersal into memory, everywhere and nowhere. 3 hypotheses, 3 tides. Escape and rebirth in Scotland and Portugal. Seizure and erasure under the French crown. Scattering and survival in fragments of paper and memory. Each offers its own truth, each its own doubts, and as the debate endures, the motifs return. The sound of distant drums echoing across water, the flutter of parchment in a lantern's glow, the steady hush of the tide, drawing back into silence. Ahead, the final shore waits, the ending of the tale, not with certainty, but with quiet reflection. For whatever course the fleet took, it has vanished into legend, leaving us to drift in its wake, lulled by the rhythm of waves, until only sleep remains. The harbor is quiet now. The clamor of arrests has faded. The voices of kings and popes have dimmed. What remains is the soft lap of water against stone, the creak of an empty dock, and the memory of sails unfurled beneath a silver moon. The lost fleet of La Rochelle has slipped away once more, leaving us on the shore with questions unanswered. Did they reach the misty coves of Scotland, standing beside an outlaw king on the field of Bannockburn? Did they find sanctuary in Portugal, where a new order carried their cross into the age of discovery? Or did they sail farther still, into the deep Atlantic, bearing maps and secrets no record could capture? Perhaps the true treasure was not gold at all, but the quiet bundles of parchment, numbers, and names written in ink, more enduring than any chest of silver. We cannot know. The centuries hold their silence. Some say silence proves nothing, that the fleet was a myth, an invention of later ages. Others believe silence is the strongest evidence of all, a gap where something once lived, erased too carefully to leave a trace. Between those positions lies the open water, wide as the horizon at night. And so we return to the paradox with which we began. A fleet that may have sailed, or may never have existed, yet has endured longer than many that surely did. For it is not ships or gold that survive centuries, but stories. Stories slip between generations like tides between rocks, carrying fragments, images, questions. They whisper in the wind. They echo in the sound of distant drums. They rise again whenever we look out across a darkened sea and wonder what might lie beyond. Close your eyes now and listen. The tide moves with steady rhythm, drawing out, returning in. The sails are furled, the ropes swaying softly. In the air there is the faintest trace of wax and parchment, the rustle of pages turning in an unseen hand. Above, the moon drifts westward, and the mist thickens, veiling the water until sea and sky are one. The lost fleet fades into that mist, as it always has, leaving only a quiet wake of mystery. And in that wake, peace. For mysteries do not demand solutions tonight. They only ask to be carried gently, like a candle through a darkened hall, its flame wavering, its light soft, its smoke rising to join the shadows above. The drums are distant now, their beat slower, softer, like a heartbeat settling into rest. The tide falls. The air is still. The story has become silence. And as the silence deepens, you may drift with it, out upon calm waters, under a quiet moon, into dreams, into rest, into sleep. Welcome always to the Bedtime History Series here on Serene Myths. May the tide carry you gently through the night.